The topic for discussion tonight, I think, is two elements under the same heading: ending the vestiges of empire. If you've been watching our YouTube videos from Susan and Barbara over the last number of weeks, you recognize that we're kind of drilling down on this question of two systems: a system that the United States represents, a system of sovereign nation states, a system um, based on the consent of the governed, economic development, and another system which doesn't necessarily operate from any one nation. You know, an empire isn't necessarily governed by the UK or by the EU or by any particular country, but it's a kind of apparatus that looks to control and suffocate nations to its own benefit. And its own benefit is just largely, like you might say, any other corporation's benefit. It's incorporated. It's not outside corporate systems. It's incorporated, but it's incorporated to serve its interests, not the interests of the broad swath of mankind, not the huddled masses. And that's very much the difference between the two systems. But what I want to get at tonight is ending the vestiges of this imperial system. And there are two kinds of vestiges. One is the kind of cleanup you see President Trump doing right now in foreign policy, whether it's Venezuela, it's Greenland, it's Canada, it's the EU and NATO, it's Iran, it was North Korea to a large extent in his first term, it's the war with Russia and Ukraine. So we'll touch on some of those elements just to put them in context. I know a number of people, I've gotten questions over the last week on Venezuela and shooting the gunboats, overthrowing Maduro. Is this constitutional? We got some of those questions last Thursday on the live show with Susan and Adam. And so I want to put these elements, or say Venezuela and some of these other foreign policy questions, into the context of how we might want to think about what President Trump is accomplishing. And that doesn't disregard also the domestic policies. The blow up in Minneapolis, of course, has become something that everyone is increasingly, thinking about or fixating on because of media attention. In some sense, that was just bound to happen because our nation is just deeply divided on what direction do we take. And that's true for our country. It's also true to some extent for the world. There are certainly institutions who don't want to go in this new direction. Then there's another element, though, entirely of the vestiges of empire. And it's an element that probably affects you more on a personal level or within your family or within your community. There's a famous poem by the founder of ancient Athens when it was refounded under a constitutional system. It was a great poet and statesman named Solon. And in Solon's poem, he describes the kind of tragedy, the tragedy that kind of rips into a culture, into a country, into a people, but doesn't just operate on the facade, doesn't just operate within the institutions, doesn't just operate in wars or within certain groupings, but that it enters into the very inner courtyard of your own home, even your own soul. And there's a certain sense that what President Trump is accomplishing is starting to eliminate these vestiges of empire. And people like Charlie Kirk and his sacrifice and what he represented and his martyrdom, these kinds of elements are also part of ending, because let's be honest, was the United States a kind of a broken shell, a rusted out old husk of drug addiction and poverty and welfare addiction and dependency in 1955 or 1960? I mean, to a large extent, we were the most productive and affluent and materially well-off country mankind had ever produced. So there was something lurking in the culture or something lurking outside the basic parameters, outside what we might think of as ultimate success or victory politically. We're doing great. We're doing fine. Everything's good. People are dressing well. I mean, we all see the pictures, even the civil rights movement. I mean, even if people went to Vegas, they still put a suit and tie on. And Vegas was hot then, too. I mean, there was a kind of dignity and a representation in the culture, but yet something still was off. And so if we don't address this other vestige, we set ourselves up for not long-term, we don't set ourselves up for long-term success. And no one here wants to make the sacrifices you're making. No one here is committed to this kind of war and cultural fight and wants to kind of hand over a big problem to their grandchildren. We want to get at it root and branch. So let's dive into some of the specifics. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, you should like and subscribe. You should join Promethean Action. Go to prometheanaction.com and sign up for our newsletter once a week. You can also get other emails. Join this movement, join this political fight. We're going to expand our operations with more content. We also want to get people more engaged in this broader cultural element. In that regard, let me just do a quick push. We had a great Saturday class, and if you haven't watched it yet, it is on this same YouTube channel, The Third Christian Renaissance. You should check that out. Okay, let's dive into these questions from what President Trump is doing. Because what Venezuela represents, or Greenland, or Canada, or the EU or NATO, if you haven't noticed, Elon Musk is in a major war with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, who wants to shut down X because it can make images of Keir Starmer naked in a bikini, or other things, other salacious questions, even things that we would all probably consider to be inappropriate, children and so on. You can create fake images of all kinds of things. And Keir Starmer wants to shut down X. And Keir Starmer is appealing not to France and Germany, maybe he is, but he's looking explicitly to the main dominions of the Commonwealth, Canada and Australia, to join him in this. So you've got the Commonwealth, which is Canada, it's Australia, it's New Zealand. You've got Greenland, which is part of the Danes Commonwealth. You've got Venezuela, which is part of this kind of narco-terrorist Commonwealth. And trust me, they are building, I don't know if they would ever call it a Commonwealth, something like a caliphate, something like a drug empire, but that's certainly what they're building in places like Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and elsewhere. The same kind of operation you see in the Middle East and this radical Islamic terror that really took off in many regards with the Ayatollah regime's coup in 1979, what they would call the revolution. So all of these elements, all of these nations have become co-opted. Some of them never had true independence, though there have been better times in Australia and Canada. They have been co-opted into an imperial structure. And this is how it works. They look to infect or overtake countries that show weakness, that show vulnerability. They look to build those vulnerabilities. They look to promote policies like free trade, free market obsessions. It's so free market that Wall Street dominates everything, right? That's not exactly what we mean by free market. We mean fair trade. We mean a fair market, a market that companies can enter it and operate effectively. If you push radical free market ideologies and radical free trade policies, you will ultimately break countries down. And if at the same time you're lending to them, like the IMF might lend to Venezuela or Mexico or Argentina, and you're lending them billions of dollars based on radical free trade and radical free market doctrines, then you ultimately are destroying these countries, plunging them into a kind of chaos, and then you offer what? You offer a socialist solution. This is the Hugo Chavez kind of characteristic. But these ideologies were shopped out, built up, and developed largely in the British Empire, largely in England itself, oftentimes known as British liberalism. This kind of promotion of let's deal with mankind's more desires and create a society that fulfills all of the society's basic interests and desires. But that's fundamentally different than what we are as a country. We were shaped not by us setting up a society that met all of our physical desires and interests. I want housing, I want free health care, I want child daycare, I want free buses, I want free subways, I want, the Mamdani approach, which is backed up by the same billionaire oligarchs that supported Obama or Biden or Kamala. Our nation was founded on a different sense of mission, that you could come here and you could live free. Your heart's relationship and mind's relationship to God and the Creator was unfettered. It wasn't chained down by social customs or what the state said you had to worship or how you had to worship or how you had to think. But it was also a commitment that we have to build a society. We have to build a civilization. And whether it was the Pilgrims and John Robinson, or it's the Puritans and John Winthrop, both of them make calls to the early American settlements in Massachusetts towards a sense of brotherly love, a concern for the common good, a sense of concern for one another, because we are building a civilization, not a society that's going to give you and provide you equal distribution or meet all of your desires or let your physical desires run wild. That will drive economic and social success. And so, in some sense, what you have in some of these places, like Venezuela or other parts of South America or even Mexico, are decades of failed economic dogma, the same dogma that plunged the United States into economic disintegration was also being applied to the nations in the Americas, like Venezuela. They got Hugo Chavez, we got Obama, 9 years later, basically. But we had more, guardrails. We had more protection set up in defense against this kind of ideological insanity. So what Trump is cleaning up, and this is true in Trudeau, Canada. This is true with the kind of social welfare state of Canada, much like Europe, independent of any protection or military expenses, massively built off of immigration communities over the last 40 or 50 years, no sense of exploring or developing its resources, similar to Chavez and Maduro's Venezuela. No real development. We're just squandering the wealth we have. We're not building up our population. We're not developing our oil resources, developing its timber. It gives Alberta a massive hard time. And yet Alberta funds all of the welfare states in places like Quebec or British Columbia, Vancouver, and so on. So there's a kind of fight over how these nations will be governed. Will they be governed by using their resources, building a civilization, building a society, or is it going to be based on exploiting its population, supporting various illegal activities, and ultimately becoming dependent upon not their own national wealth, not their own national talents, not the institutions internal to the country, but they become dependent on the IMF, on the World Bank, on global finance, on private equity, and they are now easily and totally controlled. Controlled to do what? To run operations against the United States, the leading and most important nation state. So, how does Greenland fit into this? Well, Susan covered that in an excellent video that's posted today on Promethean Action Channel. So if you haven't seen it yet, it's worth watching. But Greenland plays a similar role. There's no development in Greenland. There's no advanced sense of resources, of Arctic development. The Danes aren't building ice-breaking ships to open up the seaways. Russia is building dozens of these kinds of ships. The United States, I think, has 2. I think we have 1, we're building another one, or we have 2 and we're building the 3rd. I mean, it's kind of a joke in terms of the commitment. Is Canada building this? No. They're saying we shouldn't allow the planet to warm. We don't want these seaways to open. Russia, China, India, other nations recognize this is happening. It's not because of, or simply because of man-made activity. It's not because of man-made activity. And they're exploring and developing the Arctic resources, trade routes, and trade routes mean all kinds of new economic potentials. Ports, industries, cities, the whole thing begins to develop. That's what trade routes always do. So Greenland becomes part of this question of what is happening. Is it going to be left into the hands of these green fanatic European unions? Is it going to be seen by NATO as a way of going to war with Russia? I mean, the UK and Keir Starmer want to deploy the UK and Germany are discussing some kind of military deployment to Greenland. For what purpose? To go to war, to have a missile launch facility towards Russia? That's exactly what the United States doesn't want. What we want is a kind of positioning of this outlook, this historic and traditional outlook of the United States, dominating in an uncompromising way, dominating the Western Hemisphere. Trump and Chris Wright have said in Venezuela. We are going to sell their oil. We have basically put them into an embargo. We will take the oil, we will sell it, and we will put the money back into Venezuela in ways that are beneficial for the Venezuelan people. What do the United States people get out? We get a kind of a nation-building perspective that doesn't depend on U.S. dollars or U.S. budget, the government budget. We get a nation that can recommit towards its own industry, its own development, its own talents. And this will take time to establish a government committed to this, but we're just going to hold its hand, set up some guardrails, and work with the people that are currently in power. This is not the neocon regime change. This is a policy of saying, look, it's intolerable to have a festering wound of empire operating to the destruction of our own country within such close proximity in our own hemisphere. Now, the argument goes, but we should deal with this from the standpoint of international law, international rules, our constitution. Presidents can't go around just kidnapping regime leaders. Of course, in a perfect world, we could sit back and just say, look, everyone's now going to start operating the best way. The United States is back. We're going to operate on our principles, and you now have to too. Okay, so stop acting like a bunch of jerks and start acting like people of high principle and character, because that's what we're going to do. This doesn't work that way. You can't sit back. This is not a liberal, this isn't a question of foreign policy by way of liberal university education. Let's all get in a room and discuss our opinions and see what we think, and we'll make new discoveries or new insights. That may work for education. It's great for college students. This is a war against an empire. That's why Trump's threats to Canada are funny, the 51st state, but we are at war. They are out to destroy us. And everyone on this call and everyone listening to this on YouTube knows that you're in the political fight today because you realize at some point in the last decade, we are at war. They are out to destroy us. That's what COVID was. It wasn't a coincidence that Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were setting up things like concentration camps for people that didn't behave well, or debanking truckers because they didn't like the government's policies. This is warfare. If you play by their rules, you will lose. The question, though, is to make sure we can do this from the standpoint of an economic principle. And that's where the fight lies inside the United States. That's why the domestic factor is not unrelated. The situation in Minneapolis, of course, was striking for everyone because no one wants to see an American just get shot for acting like an idiot. And that's what the woman was. She thought she was it's kind of one of these women who didn't go through what most young men go through in adolescence, where you get rebellious, you cause trouble, you disregard authority, you push boundaries, and you find out that that has limits. You will run into the electrical fence at some point. But she probably never went through that, and now she's pretending like her wife to be like a 16-year-old boy and think they can just screw around. And literally, they're just like running over a cop. Like, that's insane. That's just insane. But the underlying factors are a mass immigration, open border policy, massive welfare fraud, all of which goes towards a huge election fraud scenario. So Trump is addressing this. Scott Bessent was in Minneapolis this weekend. He was holding in people like Chris Rufo, the gentleman that worked with Nick Shirley on that expose on the Somali fraud, a number of other people who have been engaged in this. One woman was working in autism. She said, Minnesota is now shutting off all funding for autism centers. It's like, how does that help? We've got some centers who are legitimate in doing, God's honest work, working with these children, and you're going to shut off funding to us too. So they're attempting to deal with this. And Bessent said, we're going to deal with this like we deal with the cartel operation near the border, the money laundering, the remissions, leaving the country through these kind of money financial centers. We're going to look at all of it. We're going to lower the thresholds by which things are considered criminal activity or suspicious. We're going to overhaul this entire process. These are huge steps. This is a problem that has been going on for 40, 50 years. This is not something new. these pathways, this kind of illegality has been building up and accumulating for like 4 or 5 decades. But that's really not what Trump is doing most importantly to defeat the vestiges of empire in the United States, though it's a big part of it. But it's not the biggest part. The biggest part is what Trump's doing on the industrial and scientific side. We are, within the course of less than 4 weeks, going to be circumnavigating the moon for the first time since like 1973. This will be not in black and white television on CBS and NBC and broadcast news. It's going to be live streamed 24/7 on an internet age where every person has a phone in high definition color watching kind of the shoulder cams of astronauts and what their experience is like, because we haven't left low Earth orbit since I've been alive. Trump is investing, and there are a number of people investing, into fusion energy plants. We're going to have 2 fusion energy plants under construction within the course of this year, one in Virginia and likely another one somewhere in Tennessee. And that doesn't even speak to the amount of factories that have opened up, the manufacturing, the trade deals, the capital investments, the kind of job creation that's going to be taking place. And everybody screams about, or some people do, not everyone, screams about job numbers and employment numbers. But nobody wants to say, I mean, you can see it on X, you can see it on commentary, that we're taking a lot of people who were part of the black market labor force, illegal labor, and they're no longer being hired. We're no longer creating jobs for something like 200,000 people a month or 1 million people a month, whatever the numbers were under, about staggering how many people came in. But we were creating jobs. They were part of the economic job numbers. It's almost, that's one of the most criminal things I've ever heard. Oh yeah, we're creating jobs for a bunch of people that weren't here last month. And that's job growth? No wonder so many Americans weren't in the labor market. So these kinds of changes are just massive. And people will question, I don't think too many people, maybe on this call, but maybe there are some who don't like such an intense immigration enforcement. But this is a brewing fight. And it's a brewing fight because we've lost a cultural orientation. We've lost a sense of what matters. So what matters is just reacting to the new bad phenomena, whatever that the left wing describes as bad. And some of this becomes part of how do we view culture and society? What is the ultimate good? What is the ultimate bad? For too long, things like Adolf Hitler were the ultimate bad. The Nazis were the ultimate bad. Everything bad was Adolf Hitler. That's as bad as it can get. And in some ways, anything that was not what Adolf Hitler was. So if Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were anti-gay, then pro-gay means it's good. And a culture has been built up on these kinds of values. But what that really speaks to is a loss of a deeper sense of value structure. Now, a lot of the Christian churches have been a problem for a long time, but we see a resurgence. We see a resurgence in our country regarding what it means to be an American. I mean, the idea prior to 2020, many Americans believed that you could vote and you would change. Voting for a new president, voting for Congress could have some clear positive effect that would hold, that would make a difference. Even if that still seemed crazy to many people, they still recognized there was a vestige of truth in that conception. After the 2020 election, many people realized that's just not true anymore. Simply voting and then going back to the couch or the lawn chair or the beach house or the cabin and kind of try to just enjoy life and raise family and work the jobs would somehow keep the country running. Something else was going on. And that means you're awakening to a different sense of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be an American, because we can engage in this kind of political activity. I mean, part of the reason why France has so many protests is because try organizing the French federal government. There's so many palace gates, you're never going to talk to anybody. We can go. Part of why January 6th happens is because we can go and talk to our members of Congress, That is possible. You used to be able to walk prior to 9/11 just around the Capitol Rotunda. You didn't have to get an appointment. You didn't have to get a tour guide. We were a very open society in the best way, not in the George Soros way. You could literally walk around the Capitol, check out the statues, check out the paintings. It was our government. And so our sense of what the United States represents, what Trump has introduced in terms of tariffs and trade and economics, has changed the sense of, yeah, we're not a country based on ideologies. We're a country that seeks an economic policy that benefits us and our people. We don't believe in adhering to some rule. We believe in adhering to the development of the country. That explains Trump's foreign policy. It explains his approach to Venezuela. One of the New York Times interviewers he did last week asked him, what do you believe in international law? He's like, no. He's like, well, what kind of limits? Well, he didn't say no. I mean, in one case he said no. In other cases he said, we want to abide by it. But he said, what puts restrictions on your intervention in Venezuela? Nothing but my mind. But I'm a moral person. I don't want to do anyone any harm. What does that mean? We're not following anybody's rule book, but we are abiding by a deep sense of principle. That's a revival of what it means to be an American. But the question is, what are our principles? And our principles aren't just something unique to the United States. As in our founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence, we believe these truths to be self-evident and to be universal. That means they apply to human beings, that some cultures may not identify them, some cultures may not have access to them. They haven't developed a sense of these principles, but principles that operate independent of subjective reality. They are universal principles. Hence, they're principles. And that suggests a deeper understanding of how the universe works. It's not a materialistic universe. It's a universe that there is higher principles and there is a single unifying higher principle in a creator. So as much as there's kind of a reawakening in the country, there's also a reawakening in terms of religious perspective and religious worldview. And some people might think this is categorical, that in some sense you might turn to religion and that you'll find use there. And then you also have politics and you watch your political shows. One of the things we've got to figure out, this is part of why we hold these discussions and what Promethean action is that we want to be able to help unify. There is no categorical distinction between politics, economics, science, or religion. These things are not separate. You don't have politics on one hand and then economics on another, and they don't talk to one another. There's no interaction. No, your politics is directly related. It's a political economy. It's a society as a whole. It's a civilization. And when it's a civilization, you don't have economics without science. And you don't really have any of it if you don't have some conception of a kind of universe you're confronting. What kind of universe are you dealing with? Is it a universe where good and evil both exist? A Faustian universe? Or is it an Augustine universe? That evil is only the insufficient, it only indicates an insufficient level of good, that good is ultimately all that exists. Yeah, these are philosophical questions, but they're questions that are intimately tied to how our civilization advanced and developed. In some ways, a society, you can tell when a society is advancing, when it's once again hypothesizing what the nature of God is. Because it's one of the most important questions. What is God? Or as our founder once said, what is God that man is made in his image? What does the course of human activity, what does the course of development from our nation 400 years ago in 1620, with the initial colonies in Massachusetts, to today, 400 years later, what does that indicate about the nature of God that we were able to accomplish going from a foothold that barely survived the first winter, building log cabins, trying to develop our own tools and capabilities, but yet we had the benefits of European civilization, the developments of the English language, and certain political and cultural identity. But we went from what was a quality of life not unsimilar to everything that existed 2,000 years or 10,000 years ago to where we are today 400 years from now, from then, 400 years from then, to what we're accomplishing. What does that tell us about the nature of God that he made possible and accessible that level of human advancement to where society could increasingly flourish, that we could sustain 300 plus million people with an increasing amount of time, preferably, a society that would be a little bit more supportive than it is today. We all agree on that. With the ability to contemplate God in ways and contemplate the universe and contemplate the nature of our nation and of our culture in ways that many people 400, 500, 600 years ago could never possibly imagine. And in some sense, Trump's own courage to fight through this dynamic, the same courage we saw in Charlie Kirk, that quality of courage, that quality of fight did more than probably any preacher at any pulpit. And it's awakening in us as a people, a reevaluation, not just of our nation, not just of our citizenship and our responsibilities to our nation and to our society, but also a sense of our responsibility to God and to those universal principles. And it's those principles which define our Constitution. It's those principles which define our Declaration of Independence. It's those same principles which define the solar system, gravitation, and science and technology. And those principles are accessible to the human mind. I mean, ironically, people would think, well, Trump doesn't discuss any of this. Some people comments on our videos, people say, well, Trump needs to say this. I'm not sure. Trump isn't the kind of person here to philosophize. He's here to act at a moment of crisis. He's here to solve a problem as a builder, as a patriot, as a leader. But it's almost without doubt that his leadership is having this effect. It's reawakening that sense of identity within us. And it's our responsibility to reawaken this sense of identity as a cultural phenomena. That this is the vestige of empire that existed in the post-war era. Susan Kokinda in her videos often talks about this post-war period, this kind of control of the imperial kind of deep state apparatus. And in some sense, they planted cultural tendencies at that time, which made us very susceptible to their frauds and deceptions. In some ways, it's getting at these deeper questions, which really are the deeper vestiges of empire. And by rooting those out, I don't think we're just establishing a third American revolution. I think we're establishing a new Christian Renaissance, a new breakthrough in the way our civilization operates. And that's something that can empower the coming generations, especially the younger generations of Americans today, to accomplish things we could never have imagined. Because that quality of identity is responsible for that leap of transformation from 1600s to where we find ourselves today, having a discussion on computers in our homes with electricity and running water and indoor plumbing, and the ability to engage in these kinds of ideas, even though we're not sitting in the same room, and contemplating what kind of culture and civilization we're going to build based on these principles that were the same ones our founding fathers were contemplating. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the two different kinds of the vestiges of empire. I look forward to your discussions and thoughts. So why don't we get at it and see what people have to say? And as Keisha said, if you want to make a comment or question, oh, there she is. Okay. *6 to unmute, *9 to raise your hand if you're on the phone. Otherwise, just hit the hand button at the bottom of Zoom. And we'll take your questions and see what you have to think or see what you have to say.